Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please feel free to give a like on this video, and to subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I am actually bringing you a bit of a special video for my channel. I do these types of videos every once in a while, but not very often, but they always do well, so I do enjoy doing them, and this is one where it made sense for me to do this type of video. And that is a ranking video for all of the Final Destination movies, including the newest one that I saw a couple weeks or so ago, Bloodlines. And the reason it made sense for me to do this in a ranking form is because I had not really seen any of the other Final Destination movies before seeing Bloodlines this year, so yeah, I was brand new to the franchise this year. Of course, I'm aware of some of the kill scenes, I'm familiar with them, and I've seen several of them out of context of the movies. Now, before I get into my ranking, I did want to give some of my overall thoughts on the franchise as a whole, and one thing that really did surprise me, and one thing that I actually really did appreciate about this franchise, is how consistent it is. And I mean that in terms of how it uses its plot, and how it keeps to the formula pretty similarly for each movie, but it always does a good job at managing to find a new twist in its formula, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And I actually think it might end up being one of the most consistently decent to good horror series overall. There's actually only one movie in the series that I didn't really like. The rest of them I liked, which is actually a better average than I had for the Friday the 13th movies that I've ranked all of, or the Halloween movies I've ranked all of. Now, does this mean it has the same highs as those series? No, definitely not. There's no 5-star masterpiece here like the original Halloween, and I would even say that the best of, for example, the Friday the 13th franchise does strike me as a little more interesting than this series does. But it did impress me how consistently decent to good these movies were, with one that I would even say is pretty great at my number one spot. And I think it is because, actually, they kept to the formula pretty consistently, and they didn't try to deviate from it too much. They didn't try to throw in too many crazy new rules, and the new rules that they threw in made sort of logical sense in the movie's very illogical world. Enough preamble, let's talk about the Final Destination series, most famous for its crazy over-the-top death scenes, and we're going to be ranking from worst to best. Let's go ahead and start with what I think was the worst of the series. So at number 6, and without a doubt the worst, and it is remarkably worse than the rest, is Final Destination 4, also just called The Final Destination. I suppose this was sort of meant to be a soft reboot for the series after the series had been away for a little bit of time, and the movie was released in the time where 3D was a huge gimmick. 3D is not much of a gimmick now, but it was a big deal when this movie released, so it is one that is very much so of its time, distinctly a 2000s feeling movie. And for this movie, that is not a good thing, in my opinion. For one, it has probably the most thin characters in the series, and I'm not going to say that the characters have ever been a big strength of the Final Destination movies. In fact, I would say that's where a lot of the movies do falter the hardest, but this one, it has horrible, just thin characters. I couldn't find it in my heart to care about any of them. I will say that for pretty much every other Final Destination movie, I did find it in my heart to at least care to some degree for the protagonist and them trying to stop the deaths from happening, but the protagonist here was just so bog standard generic. The movie doesn't even have names for certain characters just because of how generic they are. There's literally a character in here that dies at the beginning of the movie that is the first death that happens when death is taking its typical revenge route, and he's just called racist. And there's other characters with just generic names, like they literally call someone a MILF in the movie. I mean, come on. You know the movie you're watching is not really taking itself seriously at all, and isn't really caring about itself as anything other than a product. This movie was clearly just trying to ride off what people had enjoyed about the other Final Destination movies, but severely missed the point, I think. The deaths in here are also incredibly underwhelming. I didn't really care for the opening, cold open death scene with the track race, and I feel like generally all the other movies do a good job at tapping into deaths that people would actually be scared of. I'm not sure how many people are deathly scared of dying at a racetrack because it is a situation that feels a little bit unlikely. But this movie, it plays it up so much and it is so stupid. And what really doesn't help this movie at all is the disastrous 3D. Now, maybe at the time this was considered cool, but even looking at the reviews, it seems like audiences and critics didn't like it and found the CGI to be overwrought and ridiculous for the 3D effects. And yeah, it looks even worse now. I feel like the deaths are hand-fed to our main character and how they're going to happen, and he still struggles to stop any of them, which makes him and his girlfriend Lori both look incredibly stupid in this movie. That's really the biggest problem here, is that the characters are incredibly dumb, and it's more so insulting to the audience's intelligence than the other Final Destination movies, I think. Yeah, as I was saying, the other death scenes in this are very underwhelming as well. Not only the opening one, but the other death scenes. There's not really one that I remember that well. Some of them just sort of left me shrugging my shoulders, like this death scene that happened at a pool where you don't even really get to see much of what happens. One that just ridiculously happens with a lawnmower pushing a rock into a person far away and killing her that way. They all come across as incredibly underwhelming and incredibly silly, in my opinion. I found this one to be thoroughly forgettable, and it felt like the one that slogged on the longest, even though it is actually the shortest Final Destination movie. And yeah, I just hated this movie overall. I didn't find a single redeemable element in it, really. There were some scenes that were sort of ironically funny with how badly written they were, but otherwise, I did not care for this one at all. It is definitely one of my least favorites in this horror action genre that I've seen. Now, for the rest of these Final Destination movies, I actually do have more positive to say than I do negative, and I actually sort of hate ranking this one, Final Destination 2, so low, because this one has what is, without a doubt, I think the best cold open of any of the Final Destination movies, the best premonition death scene with the log truck. Everyone knows this one. I think even if you haven't seen the Final Destination movies at all, you're at least semi-aware of this death scene. I think it is easily the highlight of all the Final Destination series, the best thing that the whole series has to offer in terms of the big death scenes that it has. It is a huge set piece, incredibly impressive, and when you can't think it gets any more insane, it does. And the build-up to it is great as well. I just love all the warning signs that our main character is seeing, including the Highways of Hell sort of radio song playing from AC/DC, as well as seeing trucks that are giving dangerous premonitions like drinking will kill you, or this kid with a truck crashing into another car. It all feels very foreboding and works well when the scene actually happens, but it still leaves your mouth hanging open just because of how utterly insane it is. Having the best opening death scene almost works to its detriment in some ways, because the rest of the movie can't really quite match up to the excellence of that opening scene. Not that the rest of the movie is bad, not by any means. And I do like the different twists that this movie has with how death operates. This one introduces some more interesting rules to the scene that the first Final Destination didn't have, which I do like, including the fact that if you bring someone back to life, and they initially die, but you bring them back, then their life is saved and it skips on to the next person. I thought that was a cool twist. I also liked that the movie brought back Clear Rivers, although I do think the movie did her a little dirty, and I wish that they had ended her story off much better than they did, because it feels like just sort of a whimper rather than a bang. She should have at least gone out with a bang rather than the sort of annoyingly generic way that she went out. Like I said, I do generally like most of the main characters in the Final Destination movies, and I think Kimberly is a fairly likable one. She isn't one of the best, I would say. I think she's maybe one of the weaker main characters, but I did like her, and I think she played things pretty smart, like most of the protagonists do. She doesn't make too many stupid decisions, and I think she does her best at trying to keep everyone together as much as she can. I think the side characters in this one were maybe the most unmemorable outside of the Final Destination. I think the side characters here weren't quite as memorable. I did like the cop. I thought he was a good sort of second main character to Kimberly, and I think he was pretty sympathetic here. I also thought Eugene Dix was pretty fun. I thought Terrence Carson was having a fun time with him, and he was definitely the most interesting to watch. I also do think that this one, unlike the first Final Destination, I think this one sacrifices its atmosphere in a lot of places, and it isn't as creepy, and I did feel there was a little bit less of a mystery here. Some of the dialogue does fall a little bit flat, and some of it is very much so on the nose, but still, when this movie knows how to have fun, it does have fun, and I do think that some of the deaths were intentionally more comedic here. I like that this movie had a little bit more light and levity scenes that worked well, but I do think that it falters a little bit because it does have a less interesting cast that you care less about, and I do think that there are places where it just isn't as interesting to me as some of the better Final Destination series. Alright, next at number 4 is the newest Final Destination Bloodlines. And I totally get why this one is getting the positive reception, and I do think it's deserving of it. I think all of these top 4 movies that I'm talking about are good to great, and I do think this is a good Final Destination movie. It brings what you love about Final Destination. I think the opening death scene with the skyline premonition is really cool, although maybe a little too reliant on CGI, although not as obnoxiously bad as the Final Destination. And I think the movie does have an interesting twist in that the opening premonition is actually not from our main character, but from a family member of the main character. It brings an interesting twist, and it actually helps you see something that you wouldn't expect. I like that each Final Destination movie does have something new that you don't expect that brings a little fun twist to the formula so that not literally everything is predictable. But the rest of this movie does do a good job of keeping with what you know and like about the Final Destination movies. And I do think this movie has one really good thing going for it. I do think this is maybe the most likable cast in the Final Destination series outside of the first one. And I also do think it helps this movie that they are a sort of family unit, that there is a family element going on in here. I think that actually is a no-brainer for helping you care for the cast more and care for them getting out alive more, and it does make you feel more for when a character dies because you know that they have that deep familial bond going on. Also, as with the other Final Destination movies, this one has a cast of mostly new actors, and I think all the performances in this are pretty decent. I actually liked Caitlin Santawana as Stephanie Lewis. I thought she was great in this, and I think that Tio Briones as her brother Charlie is also pretty great here, and brings a very sympathetic brother-sister-sibling duo to the forefront that I thought was really well done. I also like the woman that plays their mom. I thought she was great, and the sort of developing story they have with her and their complicated relationship with her, especially Stephanie's complicated relationship with her, is interesting. This movie brings back some really good over-the-top deaths. I thought there were a lot of really creative ones in here. The one in the hospital near the end of the movie in particular was just, I mean, it was pretty brutal, and I loved it. And I also really like the first death scene that Stephanie sees with the lawnmower. That one's pretty powerfully executed as well. And this movie does, I think, what some of the other Final Destinations had sort of started to miss in the middle. A lot of these little misdirects that are appearing in the scenes of when the deaths are happening, and they build up the misdirects really well so that you aren't sure exactly when death is going to strike. I also do think that this one has a bit more of a sympathetic approach to character William Bloodworth, played by the legendary Tony Todd, who tragically passed away, and I love how they end off his character. He's easily one of the highlights of the Final Destination movies, always someone who you're wondering exactly who he is and what his motivations are, and this movie reveals it, and it's a surprising but well done reveal. And his final monologue is chilling, but I think works well. I will say what brings this movie down ever so slightly for me is I think the ending is one of the least interesting of the series. It sort of feels like it comes out of nowhere, in my opinion, and I don't know, it just didn't work for me, and felt like they were trying to repeat a previous death scene from an earlier Final Destination, but it just doesn't really work. And it left me a little bit underwhelmed, a little bit more disinterested than I would have liked it to have done. If you were wondering about my rating for this one, and I will give it a rating since it's a movie from this year, I would give this one probably a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars, which should tell you my general positive feelings about these top 4 movies. Like I said, I do think this is a good one, but I do think Final Destination has given us a little better. And speaking of better Final Destination movies, we have Final Destination 3. Now, originally when I watched this one, I did say it was my favorite Final Destination, but as I was reflecting on these movies more, realistically, I don't think this one is quite the best, but it does have some really high highs. I think the opening roller coaster death scene is fun, and once again, this one is doing a good job of tapping into something that I think is a real-life fear of people dying on a roller coaster. That's definitely one that I think would be a legitimate fear of many people, and it especially makes sense for our main character here, played excellently by Mary Elizabeth Winstead, named Wendy, who wants to have control of any situation that she can, and on a roller coaster is one where she is undoubtedly out of control. I think this is one of the most fun casts of any of the Final Destination movies, and I will admit that this one has characters that feel the most like cartoon characters, most like they aren't real people, like they're stereotypes of people that you would encounter in high school, like the jock, or the sort of creep, or the very preppy popular girls. There are definitely more thinly drawn static characters here, but it does work for the tone of the movie, I think, and I did end up having fun with it as a result, and it does help into playing with some of the most interesting and iconic death scenes outside of the opening death scene in Final Destination. I think this one has some of the best over-the-top death scenes that happen to individual characters. The sauna bed scene is just really well done. One of my favorites outside of cold open death scenes. I also really liked the ending death, especially how they kept on constantly playing around with how it was going to play out. I do really like Mary Elizabeth Winstead here, giving a great performance as Wendy, one of the only new at the time actresses who actually went on to do more, and I think you can see why. She's easily one of the best protagonists in the Final Destination series. And I really liked Ryan Merriman as Kevin Fisher, and his chemistry with Wendy is very intriguing. Also, her sister, Erin, played by Alex Johnson, is good in this too, and I like that Barry has a very specific relationship with each of the main characters in this that work well for what the movie is setting out to do. Also, the new twists they have with Death in here, and Death giving clues through pictures, is an interesting addition that I think gives this movie an element of mystery that I thought was sort of missing in Final Destination 2, so it was cool to see that mystery element coming back a bit. I also was feeling a little bit disappointed by the ending of this movie because it leaves us on the only cliffhanger that is in the Final Destination series, and it felt like an unnecessary one. I think they could have extended it a bit more to show us what happened, but at the same time, it sort of makes sense how they do it. It just felt a little sudden and a little frustrating. The rest of the movie works so well, and I think it dedicates so much to its over-the-top sense with its death scenes and how the characters are performing that it does work well as a seminally good Final Destination movie. And yeah, I enjoyed it for what it was, and I had a very fun time with it. At number 2, and I had to be realistic with myself when I was ranking these, even though this one may not include as many crazy kills necessarily as some of the later Final Destination movies, I do still think this one is one of the best, and it's the reason why this series exists in the first place, and that is the first Final Destination movie. Now, this one, I think I have good reason for ranking it at number 2. This one is the most atmospheric of all the Final Destinations, and I think that works in its favor. I love the dark, pervasive atmosphere in this movie, and there are moments where this one actually feels the closest to horror that the Final Destination series ever does. I think the opening build-up here is just sort of the excellent blueprint for what the other Final Destination movies do. It does the best job at it, though. I think just seeing all these various elements of foreboding as our main character is getting onto an airplane, and seeing him having all this uncertainty about it, and seeing all these little subtle signs about what's going on, and then finally the impact of him having that premonition, it's really well done. I also do think, and this might be the bias in me because this was the first one I saw, but I do still think that this is the best cast of characters we have in the Final Destination series, the most sympathetic or the most hateable, and you enjoy hating the characters you don't like in here, but the likable ones are really likable. I think Alex Browning is an excellent protagonist, and I really like how well Devon Sawa plays with the survivor's guilt that Alex has. Survivor's guilt is a common theme of each of these movies because these characters see that they could have saved everyone if they had maybe done a little bit more, and they blame themselves even though it wasn't really their fault and Death was going to do this no matter what. But the survivor's guilt is an interesting commentary to have, and I really do think it plays out the best in this one. And I like that the characters all have various realistic reactions to the death, and to death coming after them, with Alex being one that's trying to figure it out, and you can understand how characters from the outside would view him as a conspiracy theorist, or Clear Rivers, like, trying to understand Alex and trying to understand why he's doing these things. Whereas other characters are much more just like, I don't care, if death is going to come for me, let them come, I am still going to move forward with my life. Or other characters having the reaction of, no, I am invincible, death can't stop me, I'm going to move forward no matter what. And being in denial, essentially. It's all very valid and different reactions that I like. And I appreciate that Death feels very dangerous here. He feels like someone you don't want to mess with. He feels the most menacing here. And I think that's because of the just vengeful, ugly deaths that he does in this one that feel like he genuinely wants to get revenge on these people. I really liked what it did with this story. I really liked the cast of characters, and I just loved how it constantly kept you on your toes in terms of predicting who was going to die next and what rules would be followed. It, of course, introduced us to the great Tony Todd, and his character is so eerie in here, and you just continue wondering what he's about. There's so many great things to love about this movie, and I think it is a fun one, even if it does have some undeniable faults of some shaky writing in places, and there are definitely some parts where it's a little silly. And at number 1, and I honestly did not expect to put this one at number 1 because I had thought its reputation was bad, but maybe not so much nowadays, is Final Destination 5. I actually genuinely think this is a pretty great movie, in addition to being a great Final Destination movie. This one has all the things you expect out of a Final Destination movie, being very over the top and having crazy deaths and a cool opening death scene. And I do think this might be my second favorite opening death scene, just the collapse of a bridge and how big and blockbuster-like it feels. This is definitely the Final Destination movie that feels the most like a big budget movie. I think it also is undeniable that a reason this movie works a little better than the others is that Tony Todd is a bigger presence in this one. He has more impact on the movie, and the characters interact with him more. I think that shows just how much power that Tony Todd's character has in these movies, that when he's in it more, it becomes a more fun movie, and I think that is the case here. I also think this one adds the coolest twist in about the rules of how you can stop death from catching you. This one introduces the rule that if you kill somebody else, you can add on the years from their life to your own, and you can avoid dying in the process. That is a really cool addition that I am sort of surprised wasn't thought of earlier, but maybe it was, and maybe they didn't think about the logistics of it, but it really works in this movie, and I think it adds a degree of tension to the movie that some of the other Final Destinations don't have. It leads to a really cool climax that works well and brings character dynamics to an interesting head, I think. I also really do like our main characters in this one. I think this is another pretty sympathetic cast. I like main character Sam, but I think actually the best characters in this are his girlfriend Molly, who is just incredibly likable, and her relationship with Sam is very sweet, as well as Peter Friedkin by Miles Fisher. His character goes in some unexpected directions, and he has some material to deal with that could become cartoonishly ridiculous if he didn't play it right, but he plays it well enough that it does feel like a realistic motivation that he gains in the movie. Some of the side deaths in this movie after the cold open are also just sort of cringe-inducing in the right ways, like the gymnastics death scene with the character Candace, or the eye-related death scene with character Olivia. That is, it is just truly ugly and horrific to watch, And I like that each of the death scenes is sort of in line with the character's personality and with stuff that we had learned about them earlier, like Olivia being very focused on her body image. It makes sense that it would take place while she's trying to get an eye surgery so she doesn't have to wear glasses anymore, or Candace being very much so into her physique and wanting to be healthy, so it makes sense that her death scene takes place with a gymnastics court. Even when I compare it to the original Final Destination movies, the earlier ones, I think this one is a good culmination of everything that the movies had done and makes it better. And I think the writing is better. I think the characters are genuinely pretty interesting in here, and I especially do think that the sort of interesting way they develop the relationship between main characters Sam and Molly is well done. And like I said, having interesting character dynamics appear because of the fact that death can be avoided if you kill someone is also an interesting addition. But what really brings this movie over the top for me is the very clever ending. And I understand why this movie would have been considered the ending to the Final Destination franchise, even if I am happy that it came back with Bloodlines. This would have been a good way to end the franchise, because it has this ending twist that left my mouth hanging open. I'm surprised I never heard of this twist in all the years that I've not watched these movies. I've somehow avoided it, but I'm glad I did, because it was fun to watch firsthand, and it is something that makes total sense, and it recontextualizes the whole movie. It works very well, and I thought it was a lot of fun, and it left me feeling even more positive about this movie than I already did. So yeah, in my opinion, this is easily the best one, because not only is it just a good Final Destination movie, I think it's a pretty good movie in general. So yeah, that ends my thoughts on the Final Destination franchise. How would you rank these movies? I know people have very different rankings of these movies depending on their feelings about the Final Destination franchise. I'd also love to know what your favorite opening death scene was. Are you like me, where you like the opening log truck death scene, or do you prefer the roller coaster one, or the sky bridge from Bloodlines? What do you prefer? I'd love to know that as well. But that is all for this video, and once again, my name is James and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.